The sky was quiet that morning, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the low hum of solar panels soaking up the weak Arctic sun. Down below, in a cluster of domes half buried in snow and ice, people were starting their day like any other. Kids were drawing on frost-covered windows. Someone was brewing coffee using recycled water. A small group was checking the hydroponic garden, where greens grew under soft LED light. This wasn't some rebel fortress or military base. It was just home. A place built by people who'd left behind crumbling cities, rising seas, and governments that stopped caring whether they lived or died. They called themselves settlers, not colonists. There was a difference. Colonists take, settlers build. And this place, it was built from scrap metal, hope, and stubbornness. They traded with passing ships, shared weather data with research stations, and never asked for permission, because no one was left to give it. The world had moved on, obsessed with rare minerals under the melting ice, while these folks just wanted to live quietly, off the grid and out of trouble. But trouble found them anyway. High above, in a command center thousands of miles away, a general tapped a screen. "Target confirmed," he said, voice flat like he was ordering lunch. The order had come from the top: wipe out the illegal outposts blocking access to lithium deposits. Never mind that the outposts had been there for over a decade. Never mind that they weren't armed, didn't threaten anyone, and had even helped rescue stranded scientists during a storm last winter. To the powers that be, they were just obstacles, human clutter in the way of profit and power, and so, without warning, without a single call for surrender, the sky split open, missiles came screaming down, not with the roar of old wars, but with the clean, silent efficiency of modern destruction. One moment the settlement was alive with routine. The next, fire swallowed the domes. Metal twisted like paper. The greenhouse collapsed in a cloud of steam and shattered glass. The comms tower, hand-built from salvaged satellite parts, vanished in a flash. Those who didn't die instantly were buried under ice and debris, coughing up blood, calling out names that would never be answered. Back in the capital cities, news anchors called it a precision operation. Politicians praised the minimal civilian impact. Footage was carefully edited. No bodies. No children's toys half melted in the snow. No audio of the final distress calls that crackled for hours before going silent. The world saw a map, a red dot, and a statement. Threat neutralized. But deep beneath the ice, something else happened. No one knew it at the time, but the settlement had been built right above an old Cold War bunker, abandoned, forgotten and sealed for over 60 years. The military had known it was there, of course. They'd scanned the area before the strike, but the files were buried under layers of bureaucracy, marked low priority. Inside that bunker, crates of experimental biotech, viruses designed to enhance human endurance in extreme cold, to heal faster, to see in near total darkness. Projects too dangerous to use, too expensive to destroy, so they were just left. The bombs didn't just level the settlement. They cracked the bunker open like an egg. Frozen vials shattered. Air vents long clogged with ice suddenly sucked in the contaminated dust. The very ground exhaled something it hadn't in decades, something alive, hungry, and now airborne. At first, the survivors didn't notice anything strange. They were too busy digging through rubble, trying to stop the bleeding, sharing the last of their oxygen. But by nightfall, some began to feel different. Their eyes stung less in the blinding snow. Their cuts didn't hurt as much. One man, half buried under a collapsed wall, realized he could hear the heartbeat of a rescue drone 2 miles away. Another woman, shivering in a torn thermal suit, found her breath coming easier, even though the air was thick with ash and radiation. They didn't understand it yet. They just knew they were still alive when they shouldn't be. Meanwhile, the general celebrated. Mission accomplished. Contracts signed. Mining rigs were already being shipped north. No one thought to check the radiation levels spiking in the strike zone. No one listened to the garbled emergency beacon still pulsing from the ruins. And certainly no one imagined that the people they'd erased might come back. Changed. Because the truth was simple. You don't bomb a home and walk away clean. You don't treat human lives like roadblocks and expect silence afterward. And when you blast open a tomb of forgotten science while trying to erase the unwanted, you don't just kill people. You wake something up. The snow kept falling, covering the wreckage like a shroud, but beneath it, in the dark and the cold, hearts still beat, lungs still drew breath, and eyes, newly sharp, newly aware, began to watch the sky, waiting for the next shadow to pass overhead. The strike was over. But the real story? It had just begun. Weeks passed. The world moved on like it always does. New headlines pushed the Arctic strike off the front pages, stock markets, celebrity scandals, another election somewhere. The official report said the area was sterilized, secure, and ready for development. Drones flew over the ruins daily, scanning for radiation, checking for movement. They found nothing, just snow, twisted metal, and silence. That's what they reported back anyway. But silence doesn't mean empty. Beneath the ice and tunnels carved by melted permafrost and old service shafts from the bunker, a handful of people clung to life. Not many, maybe 24 out of over 200 who'd lived there before the bombs fell. They weren't heroes, just ordinary folks. A mechanic who fixed water purifiers, a teacher who taught kids using old tablets, a nurse who'd once worked in a city hospital before it flooded. Now they huddled together in the cold dark, sharing body heat, rationing the last of their nutrient paste and trying not to cough too loudly. Because the coughing, it wasn't normal. At first, they thought it was radiation sickness, but the symptoms didn't match. Their skin didn't blister. Their hair didn't fall out. Instead, their eyes began to adjust to near total darkness. They could see the faint heat trails of rodents scurrying through the ruins. Their sense of smell sharpened, so much so that they could tell who was coming down the tunnel just by the scent of their sweat. And the pain, it dulled. Not gone, but distant, like someone else's problem. One night, a young woman who'd lost her whole family in the blast woke up shivering, not from cold, but from something deeper. She sat up, heart pounding, and realized she could hear the wind inside the ice sheets miles away. Not the howl everyone knows, but the slow, grinding groan of glaciers shifting. It terrified her. But it also felt natural, like her body was finally listening to the world the way it was meant to. They didn't talk about it much. Fear kept them quiet, but they noticed other things too. Wounds healed faster. A deep gash on someone's arm closed in 3 days with no infection. Another, who'd broken ribs in the collapse, was walking without pain by the end of the week. They ate less but felt stronger. Slept less but stayed alert, and when they moved through the ruins at night, they did it without lights. Silent, sure-footed like shadows given form. Back in the cities, scientists reviewed the drone footage again and again. No signs of life, they kept saying. But one junior analyst, tired and working late, zoomed in on a thermal image from 3 nights ago. For less than a second, a heat signature flickered near the old comms tower. Too fast, too low to the ground to be a bear, too precise to be a glitch. He flagged it. His supervisor deleted the note. False positive, he muttered. Don't waste time on ghosts, but they weren't ghosts. They were becoming something else. The change wasn't instant. It crept in like frost on a window. Slow, quiet, impossible to ignore once it covered everything. They started calling it the shift, not out loud, just in whispers. No one knew if it was the virus from the bunker, the radiation, or some twisted mix of both. All they knew was that the world outside, the one that dropped bombs on homes and called it justice, felt farther away than ever. And the world inside their own bodies? That felt more real than anything. They began to adapt, not just survive and adapt. They learned to move in ways that left no tracks. To breathe so shallow that thermal sensors couldn't pick them up. To listen for the hum of approaching drones long before they appeared on the horizon. One of them, who used to fix solar arrays, jury-rigged a device from broken drone parts that could jam short-range signals. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. They used it to stay hidden, but hiding wasn't enough forever. One day a supply drop landed near the ruins, part of a humanitarian gesture by the same government that ordered the strike. Crates of food, medicine, clean water. A camera drone hovered nearby, broadcasting live to news channels. Proof of our compassion. The survivors watched from a ridge hidden behind snowdrifts. They saw the logo on the crates, the same one stamped on the missile fragments still sticking out of the ice. That's when something inside them snapped. Not with rage, not yet, but with clarity. They realized no one was coming to help. No one cared if they lived, and if they stayed hidden, they'd fade into myth. Another forgotten tragedy in a world full of them. But if they showed the world what they'd become, maybe someone would finally see them. So they did something bold. That night, under a moonless sky, they crept to the supply drop. Not to take the food, they didn't trust it, but to leave a message. Using charcoal from the ruins and a piece of salvaged metal, they wrote 3 words on the side of a crate. "We are here." Then they triggered the drone's return signal, forcing it to fly back to base with their message attached. The footage leaked within hours, not through official channels but through underground networks, activist servers, and encrypted forums. People saw it, a shaky clip of a drone landing in a hangar, the camera tilting down to show those 3 words scrawled in black. No faces, no voices, just proof that someone had survived. And not just survived, watched. Panic rippled through the command centers. How did they get past the sensors? Who were they? Were they armed? The generals ordered more drones, more scans, even a ground team. But every time they sent someone close, the team found nothing. Just footprints that vanished mid-stride, equipment that powered down for no reason. And once a soldier swore he saw eyes glowing in the dark just for a second, before they disappeared like smoke. Back in the tunnels, the survivors gathered around a flickering screen, watching the world react to their message. Some were scared. Others felt a strange calm. They weren't monsters. They hadn't asked for this, but the world had made them into something it couldn't ignore. And maybe that was the point. Because silence only lasts until someone decides to speak. And these people, they were done being silent. The message had gone out. We are here. Simple words, but they hit like a storm. At first, the governments tried to laugh it off. Blame hackers, call it a prank, say the drone footage was faked. But then more things started happening. Not explosions. Not attacks, just disruptions. Quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. A military comms satellite suddenly started broadcasting old emergency calls from the Arctic settlement. The real ones. The ones buried in classified files. Voices crying for help cut off mid-sentence. The audio played on loop for 6 hours before engineers could shut it down. People heard it on shortwave radios, on late-night podcasts, even through smart speakers in living rooms halfway across the world. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who it was. Then came the drones, not the big armed ones. The small, everyday kind. Delivery bots, weather monitors, even toy drones bought online. Dozens of them, reprogrammed. Flying in perfect formation over government buildings, dropping leaflets made from recycled paper. On one side, photos of the settlement before the strike, kids playing, greenhouses glowing under the northern lights. On the other, radiation maps showing the spike after the bombing with a single line. You knew what was under the ice. Security scrambled. Airspace was locked down, but the drones kept coming, launched from rooftops, forests, even moving trains. They weren't violent. They didn't carry weapons, but they carried truth. And truth, it turned out, was harder to shoot down than missiles. The people in the tunnels weren't soldiers. They'd never held a gun. But they understood something the generals didn't. In a world drowning in noise, silence is power, and so is surprise. They used what they had. Their new senses let them move unseen. Their hacked tech let them speak without being seen. And their pain? That gave them focus. One night, they broke into a data relay station on the edge of the exclusion zone. Not to destroy it, to plug in. Using scavenged cables and a cracked tablet, they tapped into the military's internal network. For 17 minutes, they sat in the freezing dark, fingers numb, uploading everything they'd found in the bunker's logs. Project codes, test results, signed orders to bury the facility instead of cleaning it up. Then they vanished before the alarms even sounded. By morning, the files were everywhere, not just on dark web forums, but on mainstream news sites, university servers, even public library databases. Journalists who'd ignored the story before now couldn't look away. Protests erupted in cities that had never heard of the Arctic settlement. Students held vigils with signs that read, "You bombed homes. You woke us up." Back in the capital, leaders held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Panic was setting in. Not because they were losing a war, they weren't even fighting one, but because they were losing control of the story. And in today's world, the story is the battlefield. The survivors didn't want a war. They wanted accountability. They wanted the people who gave the order to face what they'd done. So they sent one more message. Not through drones or data leaks, but through a live feed hijacked during a major international summit. For 30 seconds, the screen showed not a face, but hands, scarred, frostbitten, holding a child's melted snow globe from the ruins. Then a voice, calm and tired, said, "You thought we were pests. Now you've made us predators. But we don't hunt like you. We don't burn cities. We just show the world what you tried to hide." The feed cut out. The room fell silent. Outside, the world was changing. Soldiers stationed near the Arctic began refusing orders. "I have kids," one said on a leaked radio call. What if someone bombed their school and called it precision? Scientists who'd once worked on the old bioweapon projects came forward, admitting they'd warned about the risks. Even some politicians, sensing the tide turning, started calling for investigations. The survivors watched it all from their hidden screens, wrapped in thermal blankets, sipping melted snow. They weren't celebrating. There was no joy in this, only exhaustion and a strange kind of clarity. They hadn't asked for this strength. They hadn't wanted to become something the world feared. But when your home is erased and your pain is ignored, sometimes the only way to be seen is to become impossible to ignore, and they were getting good at it. They learned to move through the toxic zones like they were born there, because, in a way, they were. Their bodies processed the radiation differently now. Their lungs filtered the poisoned air. They could go days without food, weeks without warmth. They weren't superhuman, just changed, adapted, like life always does when pushed to the edge. One of them found an old radio in the ruins, not digital, real analog, the kind that crackles with static. They fixed it, powered it with a hand-crank generator, and started broadcasting short messages every night at midnight. No threats, just facts. Today, 127 children in Sector 4 went without clean water. The lithium mine opened yesterday. They're using forced labor. Remember us. People started listening. Not just activists, but ordinary folks, truck drivers, nurses, teachers, who'd never thought much about Arctic settlements or buried labs. But now they saw the pattern. When power goes unchecked, it doesn't just destroy lives. It creates consequences it can't control. And the most dangerous consequence? People who stopped believing the lies. The generals sent more troops, built higher fences, launched new surveillance satellites. But they couldn't stop what was already spreading. Not just the virus, but the idea. The idea that you can't bomb truth into silence. That every act of cruelty plants a seed. And sometimes those seeds grow teeth. The survivors didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't want statues or songs. They just wanted the world to know, we were here, we are still here, and we remember. The world was changing, and not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't war. It wasn't riots. It was something quieter, deeper, like roots cracking through concrete. The truth had spread, and once it took hold, it couldn't be pulled out. People started asking questions no one had dared to ask before. Who gave the order? Why were those settlements really targeted? And what else have they been hiding? Governments tried to clamp down. Internet blackouts, national security warnings, arrests of journalists who quoted the leaked files. But it was too late. The files weren't just online, they were printed, photocopied, passed hand to hand in subway stations and schoolyards. Someone even stitched the key documents into a quilt and hung it outside a courthouse. The message was clear. You can delete a server, but you can't delete memory. Then came the second wave, not of violence, but of connection. From slums in megacities to fishing villages on sinking coasts, people began reporting strange things. Not monsters, not attacks, but stories. A dock worker in Jakarta woke up able to hold his breath underwater for minutes, longer than should be possible. A teenager in a desert refugee camp could see heat signatures in total darkness. In a flooded district of what used to be Miami, a group of survivors developed resistance to diseases that had wiped out entire neighborhoods. At first, doctors called it mass hysteria. Then they tested blood samples and found traces of the same genetic markers first seen in the Arctic survivors. The virus, dormant for decades, hadn't just awakened in the north. It had traveled through black market medical supplies, through smuggled organs, through the very systems of exploitation the powerful had built. And now in the forgotten corners of the world it was finding new hosts, not turning them into beasts but giving them tools to survive a world that never cared if they lived. The Arctic group didn't plan this. They didn't want it. But when they heard the reports, they understood. The awakening wasn't theirs alone anymore. It belonged to everyone the system had left behind, and that changed everything. Back in the capital cities, panic turned to infighting. Military leaders turned on politicians. "You told us the bunker was empty," one general shouted in a closed-door session. "You lied to us." Meanwhile, soldiers stationed near the Arctic began sharing food and medicine with the survivors, not out of orders, but because they'd seen the footage, read the files, and couldn't unsee it. Some even defected, vanishing into the ice with nothing but a backpack and a guilty conscience. The coalition that ordered the strike started to crumble from the inside. One nation pulled out, citing moral concerns. Another froze all mining contracts. Investors backed away, scared of protests and bad press. The whole operation, the reason for the bombing in the first place, was falling apart, not because of weapons, but because people had stopped believing in the lie that justified it. Then came the offer. Not from a government, not from the military, but from a group of scientists, doctors, and former intelligence officers who'd grown sick of the cycle. They sent a message through an old emergency frequency. "We want to help. Not control, not study, help." They offered medicine, clean tech, even a way to stabilize the genetic changes, so no one would suffer, and no one would be weaponized again. The Arctic survivors debated for days. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. But they also knew they couldn't stay hidden forever, and if this was real, if people were finally willing to listen, maybe they could stop the spread before it caused more harm. So they agreed. But on their terms, they chose a meeting place, the ruins of the old settlement under open sky, no weapons, no cameras, just people. When the day came, both sides walked in from opposite directions, scarred, wary, human. No speeches, no grand gestures, just a handshake, a shared thermos of tea, and hours of talking. Not as enemies, not as victims and villains, just as people trying to fix something broken. What came out of that meeting changed the course of everything. The scientists shared everything they knew about the virus, how it worked, how it spread, how it could be contained without hurting those already changed. In return, the survivors shared their knowledge of living in extreme conditions, of healing without hospitals, of community without borders. Together, they built something new, a network of care, not control. Mobile clinics that traveled to the newly awakened, safe zones where people could learn to live with their changes without fear. And a promise. No more secrets. But the real turning point came when the survivors made a choice. They could have demanded revenge. They could have exposed every name, every signature, every coward who hid behind orders. But they didn't. Instead, they said, "Put them on trial. Not in secret courts. In front of the world. Let everyone see what happens when you treat human life as disposable." And the world listened. International tribunals were called. Not perfect, not fast, but real. For the first time, leaders who'd spent careers hiding behind flags and titles had to sit in a courtroom and answer for what they'd done. Families of the lost gave testimony. Scientists explained the buried risks. And the Arctic survivors? They didn't shout. They just stood there, calm, changed, undeniable, and said, "This is what your decision made." Some called them monsters. But most saw something else. People who'd been pushed past the edge and come back not with hate, but with clarity. The message spread faster than any virus. You can't bomb truth, you can't bury justice, and if you hurt the forgotten long enough, they stop being forgotten. The coalition didn't just lose power. It lost belief. And without belief, even the strongest empire crumbles. Now the real work began. Not of fighting, but of healing. Of building a world where no one has to become a beast just to be seen. Where home isn't a target. Where science serves life, not profit. And where the quietest voices are the ones that finally get heard. Because the awakening wasn't about rage. It was about remembering what it means to be human. And that's something no bomb can erase. Years passed. The snow kept falling in the north, but now it covered something different. Not just ruins, but renewal. Where bombs once turned homes to dust, greenhouses rose again. This time built with stronger glass and deeper roots. Solar panels glinted under the low sun, powering not just lights, but labs, classrooms, and clinics. The place wasn't called a settlement anymore. People just called it the sanctuary. It wasn't a fortress. There were no walls, no guards with guns. Just open gates and a simple sign at the entrance. If you're running from harm, you're welcome here. If you're bringing it, turn back. And somehow that was enough. The people who'd survived the strike didn't rule. They refused to. They'd seen what power without accountability did, and they wanted no part of it. Instead, they became teachers, healers, guides. They showed newcomers how to read the wind, how to purify meltwater, how to listen to their own bodies when the world went silent. Some still carried the changes, the sharper eyes, the steady hands, the way they could walk for days on little food, but they used them to help, not to control, and they weren't alone anymore. From every corner of the broken world, others came. Not just the newly awakened, but ordinary people, farmers whose land dried up, nurses tired of watching children die from preventable diseases, engineers who quit building weapons to build water purifiers instead. They came not because they were told to, but because they'd seen what happened when silence was broken. They came because they believed another world was possible. In cities far away, things had changed too. The old coalition was gone, replaced by councils made of scientists, survivors, and everyday citizens who'd once thought they had no voice. Mining in fragile zones was banned, secret military projects were outlawed, and every child now learned a new lesson in school. Power without care is just violence with a plan. But the real shift wasn't in laws. It was in how people saw each other. No one called the changed ones beasts anymore. That word had died with the lies that created it. Now they were just neighbors, friends, sometimes even family. One spring, when the ice began to soften and the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground, a group of kids from the sanctuary built a memorial, not with stone or metal but with melted snow, recycled glass, and seeds from the old greenhouse that had survived the blast. In the center, they placed a single, unbroken snow globe, the one that had been broadcast to the world years before. Inside, instead of fake snow, they put real Arctic moss, tiny and green, still growing. People came from hundreds of miles to see it. Not to mourn, but to remember. That destruction isn't the end of a story. It's often the beginning of a harder, truer one. The leaders who'd ordered the strike, some were in prison. Others disappeared into quiet exile. But the survivors didn't gloat. They knew punishment wasn't the same as healing. And healing took longer. Instead, they focused on what they could build. They shared their knowledge freely. How to stabilize the genetic changes, how to live in balance with harsh environments, how to turn pain into purpose. They didn't patent it, didn't sell it, just gave it away, like handing someone a cup of warm water on a cold night. And slowly, the world began to copy them. New communities sprang up in deserts, on coastlines, even in the hollowed-out shells of old cities, places built not for profit but for people. They traded seeds instead of weapons, shared weather data instead of secrets. When storms came, they warned each other. When someone fell sick, they sent medicine, not soldiers. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, shortages, nights when hope felt thin. But there was also something new: trust. Not blind faith, but the kind earned through showing up again and again, even when it's hard. Back at the sanctuary, the original survivors grew older. Their steps slowed, but their eyes stayed sharp. They spent their days teaching not just skills, but stories. Tell them what happened, they'd say to the children, not to scare them, but so they never forget that silence can be broken, and that even the smallest voice can start an avalanche. One evening, as the northern lights danced overhead, a young person asked the oldest survivor a question. Do you ever wish it never happened? The bombs, the changes, all of it? The elder was quiet for a long time, watching the colors ripple across the sky. Then they said, I wish no one had to suffer, but I don't wish away what we became, because in the dark we learned to see, in the silence we learned to speak, and in the ruins we learned how to build something better. That was the real victory. Not revenge, not power, but the quiet, stubborn act of choosing to care when everything around you says to look away. The world still had problems. War still flickered in distant places. Greed still whispered in boardrooms. But something had shifted in the human spirit. People understood now that you can't erase a community and expect peace. You can't poison the earth and expect clean air. And you can't treat people like they don't matter, and be surprised when they rise up not with fire but with truth. The sanctuary stood as proof that even after the worst is done, healing is possible. That the beasts the powerful feared were never monsters. They were just humans who refused to disappear. And so life went on. Not with fanfare, but with daily acts of courage. Planting a seed in frozen ground, sharing a meal with a stranger, speaking up when something's wrong. Small things. Human things, because in the end that's what saves us. Not weapons, not walls, not silence, but the simple, relentless choice to see each other. And to say clearly without fear, we are here.